Hey, welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Whispers in Nalubaale, which is the fifth and penultimate data pack in the Katara cycle. Now, this one actually came out a couple weeks ago. We've been a bit slow on the draw when it comes to the corp side of this unboxing. In fact, today the final data pack comes out, so this one's a bit of a buzzer beater. We got 10 cards on the corp side still to go through. Still some pretty interesting stuff. There's timestamps in the description below if there's a certain card you're looking for. Otherwise, let's jump right in. This is our first card, and it's an HB agenda. This is called Remote Enforcement. It's a 4/2 agenda security subtype. And it says, when you score Remote Enforcement, you may search R&D for a piece of ice, install it, protecting a remote server, paying its install cost, and res it, ignoring its res cost, then shuffle R&D. So basically, you score out this 4/2 agenda, generally in a remote server, and then suddenly your remote server got even stronger, which lets you put another agenda in it and keep going. And we've actually seen this before. This is a card that was an original core set called Accelerated Beta Test. I think there might even have been 2 or 3 of these. There's 3 of these in the original core set. And a big thing with the Katara cycle is that while some cards have left from the original core set to the revised core set, the designers wanted to make more balanced versions of those cards, or the sort of ideas that those cards represented, and introduce them into Katara cycle. And Accelerated Beta Test was kind of far from a balanced card. There was times that you fired the ABT, the beta test, and you'd get 3 big ice. You could put 2 of them on central servers, 1 on a remote server. And the runner sometimes just lost the game straight up because of that. It'd be just such a huge, unsurmountable tempo gain. And that was probably not great for the game. There's also sometimes you fired this and threw 3 agendas into archives and you also straight up lost the game, which arguably, whether or not that's fun, that's up to you. But remote enforcement largely is the same sort of idea, but a much more reasonable and a much more average power curve card. You score this thing, you get to choose what ice you have to put on a remote server, which is cool. So central servers still are a counterplay to this, and you get a res it for free. And that can be a heck of a ton of value, because while Accelerated Beta Test might only get you 2-3 credit cost ice, you can go for the big ice and get it on the remote server. And what kind of big ice could you do? This is actually a pretty good example. This is Fairchild. I think it's the most expensive HB ice right now. It is a big end the run ice, and it costs 9 credits, and it's unique. And that unique part is actually a really cool reason why you want to put only 1 in your deck sometimes, so the second one you draw is useful. And you can now search through your deck for your Fairchild and res it for free. And I think this is a perfect candidate for remote ice, because not only does it not have like a punishing face check, if you hit this you just end the run, it's really expensive. So you get a res it while it also just always ends the run, or usually ends the run. You can still get through this though, but it is really expensive. And this is the kind of idea that remote enforcement lets you build that big remote server. And there's a lot of other things you can do. This is a card that you could consider splashing big ice into your deck just to get value out of it. Chiashi is one of the best big barriers in the game, and again, that's kind of one of the drawbacks here, is if you're rezzing your Chiashi on your remote server, the 4 net damage subroutines are never going to be that nice surprise. I guess at the end of the day, you might still have these in your deck, so they still could be a surprise. But an 8 strength barrier with 3 subroutines is not too bad at all, and getting it up for free is obviously very great. There's even cards, like, you don't have to go all in on the big ice, even rezzing like a Loki for free, which doubles in a deck with big scary ice like Chiashi or Fairchild. Even just rezzing something like this for free, even like a 4 credit ice, is probably not too bad at all. It's technically, you draw the card, you install the card, and you res it all for no clicks. And that's really a fair bit of tempo, as it's often referred to in card games. You're doing a lot in a little bit of time, and it lets you continue pushing your advantage forward. It's also really important, worth knowing, that this only ignores the res costs. Anything that has additional costs, something usually on ice, the additional cost is forfeiting an agenda. It doesn't bypass that part. So if you want to go get an archer from your deck, which is a really good piece of ice, you still have to forfeit an agenda, so watch out. There's also some pocket utility for this card. We talked about Trapano, which just came out in the other part, the runner side of this data pack, and having the ability to tutor out a magnet and res it is kind of cool. Whether that ever happens, it's going to be really cool when it does. So what kind of decks can you put this into? There's actually a lot of cool synergies within different HB identities. I think this is a very flexible agenda, and I'm always really excited to see that. It's not something that's pigeonholed into a certain only one identity or something like that. And we got a lot of cool options. This is Next Design from Creation and Control, and it's a deck that can start turn 1 with ice on a remote server. And as the name implies, this is actually pretty cool with Next Ice. And Next Ice is not only more powerful the more of it you have up and rezzed, which remote enforcement does, but also Next Silver lets you rush out some agendas because it's a relatively cheap end to run ice. The idea is that you score behind your next silver and then for free you get a big old next gold, let alone there's some big next ice still coming out these days. That's not too bad at all, and it's going to empower the rest of your deck once you have this up for free. Yeah, there is a bit of synergy here with the Foundry. In theory, when Remote Enforcement fires, Foundry's ability also fires. It's not like it's that hard to get the Foundry's ability to fire, but if you want to go into the Twins, which is a really cool card in the Foundry for 1 influence, you can make it so DNA trackers res for free on your remote server, and if the runner wants to get through it, they have to get through it twice. That's cool. I think probably, even again, just getting a free Merlin, mind you, Twins, Grail Ice, Foundry is a really fun combo, and getting just a Merlin res for free on the table, having another copy Merlin in hand can be a fair bit of value. I think one of the easiest cards, or identities to get value with this is Asa Group. Because when you install that agenda, or excuse me, when you score this agenda and get that ice installed, you get to install a card from hand. It has to be an asset or upgrade in that same remote server, but that's really good. And a lot of Asa Group decks are really good at jamming things in remote servers behind relatively good taxing HB ice. And this is another thing that could be an NGO front, it could be the remote enforcement, and if it's not, well, either way, I guess no. If you want to score the remote enforcement, it's pretty good for you, because now you have a bigger remote that you can jam more stuff into. Now you gotta watch out if you want to build a deck around that. Just having good ice on a remote server, this is something that you generally find out in Netrunner after trying just a big old glacier deck with big ice, is that's a lot of times not enough. Runners can always get into remote servers if they have enough money and the breakers, so you generally want to enforce your remote server, and if you're having big ice, there's a lot of cards that you can do that with. Stimhack, mind you, runners get into servers sometimes when you don't expect them, so this is a card that combos well with other remote server centered strategies. Cards like Ash double the value of your ice if a runner has to run through it twice, once to trash Ash, once to run again, and we've seen a lot of really cool defensive upgrades. Biovault is relatively new, this is a fun one. Marcus Batty is super good, specifically if you res something with maybe some very mean subroutines. And also Mwanza City Grid is actually kind of cool. It is a bit influence intensive, but if you res that big old Chiashi on the remote server, you can make it so that the runner has to run through it 3 times in a single run, and there's a lot of value with it. We've also seen more people play Navi Mwanza City Grid because it's specifically good against a lot of cards right now that cheat through ice that are pretty popular. Cards like Kongamato and Kamali. I think there's an A in there. So you might want to try that out as well. Also, it's a 4-2 agenda, which means it's generally going to be in a remote server, but if you're playing Asa Group, a lot of times you want to play Jeeves in your deck, which means you can actually go ahead and fast advance this thing out, which is pretty sweet. If you fast advance this thing out, you have a cool remote server to jam in next turn, and that might be all you need to do on turn 2 or 3. Sure, it's a lot of your money, but maybe you have your ice resed and you're fine. Interestingly enough, this wasn't very obvious to me, but I've tried this card a bit out in Jinja City Grid decks. A lot of decks that want to build a big old remote love Jinja City Grid, and this, to me, actually kind of felt like a bit of an anti-synergy. As soon as you have a remote with 4 or 5 pieces of ice on it, because you ginged it up real good, when you score remote enforcement, you have to end up spending like 6 credits or something like that, just because they don't trigger together. So that's kind of bad, because you don't draw it, right? You may search, yeah, you don't draw it, so this actually doesn't fire, let alone you don't, yeah, it's just not the best. And finally, if there's another good reason to run Bifrost Array, these are technically like combo cards. You have to score one first before the other, but fast advancing or scoring a 3-1 agenda and getting a big ice on a remote server is always pretty cool. Very flexible agenda, can be seen in a lot of HB decks because getting free ice on a remote server is really cool. It gives you a choice what the ice is, it's always going to be good, not like Accelerator Beta Test, which sometimes can't lose you the game. That being said, back in the day, there was ways to make sure that didn't happen, but still. It's a pretty great 4-2. I'm excited to see cards like this. This is Kamali 1.0. It is a new HB. It's an ice. It's cost 6 to res, which is just about the top of mid-range ice to expensive ice. It has a bunch of subtypes. It's not only a sentry, it's not only a Bioroid, but it's also a destroyer and AP. It's looking to hurt you. And it has 3 subroutines, which is great for a 1.0 Bioroid. 1.0 Bioroids mean you can always spin a click to break any subroutine on the Kamali. And the subroutines are relatively similar. One says, do a brain damage unless the runner trashes the installed resource. Secondly, do a brain damage unless the runner trashes the installed hardware. And finally, do a brain damage unless the runner trashes an installed program. It is 3 strength, not so hot, and it is a whopping 4 influence because it's a pretty cool HB ice. In terms of the flavor, I actually couldn't figure out that much about this one. Kamali, according to Wikipedia, is a Bantu name meaning woman with wealth, and Bantu is it's like 250 Bantu languages spoken all along I think it's mostly Niger, Congo sort of area. That being said, that's all I could find on it. And whether this is a woman with wealth, maybe wearing a bunch of jewelry, I feel like the art on this card is specifically pretty inspired. So we might be missing some flavor here. Let me know if you can figure that out. So 6 cost ice that does brain damage. We've actually seen a ton of these in HB. This one, Noreen 2.0, which I've honestly haven't seen hit the table yet, is kind of a pretty good comparison to Kamali 1.0, and we've seen a lot. Mind you, brain damage has been a very central theme of HB in this cycle. We've seen so many HB cards with the word brain damage on it, and I've always been saying every time we do an unboxing that right now brain damage isn't particularly that hot, but if you have enough cards in a deck that say that word brain damage on it, eventually it becomes a viable archetype. And that's largely due to the fact that brain damage is only good if you can do a bunch of it in a certain game. It's much easier to do a lot of net damage throughout a game slowly to grind someone's deck down. It's a lot easier to do a burst of meat damage to instantly flatline a runner. But brain damage, you have to end up either doing like 4, where the runner then dies on something else, or you do more than their hand size if you do like 6 brain damage. And it's really hard to do that in the game right now, but as they print more and more brain damage cards, like Kamali, it might become easier. And that's kind of where we find ourselves now. So I'm not sure if that's there yet, but we've definitely been working on it for a while. Now, as a brain damage card, and this again is something we say a lot on this channel, is that anytime a card gives your opponent a choice, it makes the card a ton worse. This card gives the runners a lot of choices when they hit it, like a fair bit of choices. Firstly, they can always break the ice, and we'll get to that in a bit, whether or not this is a taxing piece of ice just in terms of the economy. Secondly, they can always click through the subroutines, and that's kind of par for the course with Bioroids. There's ways to benefit off of that or make that less appealing, which we'll get to in a second. And then on top of it, if you don't want to break the subroutines, if you're not going to pay for it, you're not going to click through it, you still have another choice. You can always trash one of your installed cards if you certainly do not want to take the brain damage. And while this card does technically have the ability to do 3 brain damage, which is I think the most we've ever seen on a single piece of ice, it's going to be hard to make the runner the runner's almost always going to feel in control about that. And if the brain damage is going to be a big issue, they can always trash an installed card. Trashing installed cards is still pretty good. It's not a terrible effect to have on ice, but I don't know about that. For resources, a lot of times there are resources that you wouldn't mind getting rid of. I'll lose 2 to 4 credits off a daily cast if that's what it takes to not take a brain damage sometimes. And program trashing is probably one of the ones that's against a certain faction. Against Anarchs is honestly not that terrible. I can reinstall this for 2 credits, and it is true that there's Arc Lockdown in HB, but it's something you can play around. And finally, do trash an installed hardware, which is the middle subroutine. It's probably the best one. Now, a lot of decks rely on their hardware there. A lot of them are just running only a console, and trashing that sometimes also trashes programs because MU gets used up, but it's probably the best one. But at the end of the day, again, there's so many choices that you're giving the runner with this card that it's very rare that you're going to be able to land the brain damage, specifically in a deck that really wants that to happen, because you're more likely to think, well, that brain damage seems really important for the runner's deck. I'm just going to trash my Ghost Runner, whatever resources you want to insert there. It also makes this card kind of weak when you want to combine it with other defensive upgrades and the other sort of cards you might have been putting in your deck to ensure brain damage. And a good example is Helheim Servers, which lets you boost up the strength of an ice real strong so that the subroutines fire. And while that is admittedly pretty bad on a Bioroid, it's also not great here, right? Because they have a choice. And if you want to raise a Heinlein grid so the runner thinks, okay, if I click through this, I'm going to lose all my money, they can still trash their installed stuff. And mind you, if they don't have an installed resource, if they don't have an installed hardware, perhaps it's the beginning of the game, this does get a bit better. That being said, it is a 6 cost ice. Cards, again, like Ryan Knight, not so hot. You're giving runners choices. Maybe they don't see this one coming, but Marcus Batty is particularly not great. Marcus Batty is a really strong card when it comes with brain damage decks, because if you can fire some of the mean subroutines, like the brain damage on Noreen 2.0, it just happens, let alone you draw a card, while Marcus Batty on a Kamali means the runner can just trash one of their installed things. I guess you do have a choice here, though, to make it less good. Another thing with Kamali 1.0, and again, I think we opened with this, is there's so much brain damage ice that costs around this credit value. And whether or not your deck can do brain damage and have a strong enough economy to be able to run Kamali, Noreen 2.0, Zed 2.0, Fairchild 3.0, and all this ice, it's probably not going to happen that much. A lot of the cards that we've seen specifically that support brain damage archetypes are actually financially heavy. What is the last one called? We have a tab up later, we'll get to it. But a lot of the cards that do brain damage right now are trace based, so I don't know. And then if I have a choice between putting Z in my deck, which is 1 strength more. It is a 2.0 subroutine Bioroid, so it's harder to deal with. And it has pretty similar, if not strictly better subroutines. This is the reason why I'm not in love with Kamali. There's a lot of other really good options. If we want to just do brain damage in a deck, I'd probably play Nareen 2.0 over Kamali. It depends a lot on your meta, whether code gates or sentries are harder to break, but Nareen seems a bit better to me. Now, how hard is this thing to break? Again, you can just break ice, obviously, when breakers are coming out. And 3 strength 3 subroutines is like in the middle of being okay. MK Ultra breaks it for 6 fully, which is a fair bit, but you can always spend 3 and a click, or 3 and trash something. You can even trash the MK Ultra to save a credit. Mimic, if this does become popular, perhaps Data Sucker Anarch becomes a thing because of Freedom Kamalo. This breaks for 3 credits, and that's kind of rough. Mongoose, it's like 4, I think, and Nanotech eventually does it for 3, so it's not even particularly taxing against some of the sentry breakers you might be seeing, so that doesn't sound that great. Now, 6 is a lot again. How can we play this in a deck? Of course, Architects of Tomorrow eventually reses this for 2 credits, and that's a lot better. A lot of the Bioroids, maybe some of them are overcosted. Resing them for cheaper is a lot better. Of course, always worth noting, Cybernetics Division. If you're doing brain damage, this is a thing you can do. It's like starting with a brain damage, which is cool. But again, there's probably other good mid-range brain damage ice. Fairchild 2.0 is a lot more taxing to get through a lot of times, and this is a card that does brain damage. Even again, Fairchild 3.0 is a restricted card now, but this is what Kamali is competing with, and that is kind of a hard fight to win. Again, Kill Switch, Tempest, all these cards have been coming out, and they are expensive. They still do give the runner some choices in some circumstances, but Kamali just doesn't look like the shining star that the brain damage archetype needed. But again, I gotta preface that with, or not preface, the one at the end, by saying that maybe if enough brain damage cards are printed, it'll be good. I'm not holding my breath. All that being said, having an ice that maybe sometimes just trashes installed things is not that bad. There's cheaper ways to do it. We've seen a lot of this in NBN coming out, but that's okay. I need a bit more testing with this, but I can't say I love it. Brain damage ice. There's actually very few brain damage ice that just strictly do brain damage. We've lost a couple of them. I think actually Fairchild 3.0 or 2.0 is probably one of the better ones, but again, you can click through this, pay 2 credits, so I don't know. This is still a really good piece of ice though, but like this is 2 credits cheaper? Okay. This is Warden Fatuma. She is a unique asset character. 1 to res, 5 to trash. Wow. And it says each piece of resed Bioroid ice gains the runner loses a click of Able before all of its other subroutines. It's neither cruel nor unusual, merely efficient. 2 influence, and again 5 to trash, which is a crazy ratio. I gotta go back here and then do say though, Kamali 1.0 is kind of similar to a 3.0 Bioroid. That if you are running this in a deck, it follows the same sort of game plan that you should be playing around against a deck that might be running Fairchild 3.0. Against HB, also in general, run first click. And that always lets you click through this thing, so yeah. Warden doesn't actually make that more difficult. It looks like it does. We'll get to that in a second. Warden Fatuma makes every ice, every Bioroid, and it's not that difficult to make a deck that's strictly Bioroids. It kind of makes them all Enigma, or at least the beginning part of Enigma, which is a fine subroutine. And it's a card that adds a subroutine to each piece of ice, and a specifically strange subroutine, so the question is, are we adding Warden to our deck because of A, we want to make everything more taxing, or B, because we want them to lose clicks? Or C, we want them to run less click through our ice. And there are both relevant choices, and it's great that you don't have to decide because you can make a deck that capitalizes on all 3 of them. So firstly, adding a subroutine to each piece of ice can be a really big deal. It really can. Cards like Sub Boost only do a single piece of ice, and while adding an end to the run subroutine can largely be better because it keeps people out, attach it to a big old strength ice that doesn't have end to the subroutine, seems pretty good. But just adding a subroutine to every single piece of resed Bioroid ice is a real tax. And this actually reminds me a lot of Stronger Together. Don't love Stronger Together as an identity. Not so much because it's really boring, which it is, but man, teaching the game and then having to slow down while you're doing that like really clumsy maths thing the first time you're teaching someone, and they have to be like, oh, but also this number is hiddenly increased. I digress. It's kind of like Stronger Together in a single asset. Stronger Together a lot of times will make the breaking cost of every single piece of ice +1 if they're not clicking through it, if you have increased 1 strength. Again, in a simplified scenario where every strength is 1 credit, which is not largely true. And this adds a subroutine to every single piece of ice. It is a lot like rebirthing in Warden into Stronger Together. So the idea is you can play an Architects of Tomorrow deck and run only Bioroids and then eventually get that Stronger Together tax. And that on its own, while you can trash Warden for 5, is kind of reasonable. That seems like something that could actually add up throughout a game. Now, sometimes it actually adds more than 1 credit. This, I think, actually will happen more often than the strength will matter. Anytime you're adding like an odd number of subroutines to an ice, it often can increase the tax to get through the ice. And while you don't actually have to break, the runner loses a click of Able. Something like a Black Orchestra actually increases the break cost by 3 if you want to break all the subroutines. And that actually was where this gets really interesting if you're playing against a lot of Anarchs. Like Victor 1.0, you want to break it, it costs like 6 credits. If you want to break all of it, seems okay. Now, the other reason why this would be good is because you want the runner to lose a click. You can surprise them with this. You can res an ice, you can res Warden. But again, if you're playing HB, they should expect Bioroids. They should expect to click through things. And this has, in some theory, a face check penalty. Maybe this fires with Seder Laboratories. The runner says, I'll lose a click, whatever. And then you get a recur stuff. That's kind of the dream with Seder Laboratories. And this is the sort of deck that you've seen that people like will run Mason Bellamy and then Heinlein Grid, and you can make a deck that's kind of awful if you lose a click during a run, and there's some value to that for sure. It also makes face checks a bit worse. The idea is that you always want to run and face check through things like Ravana, so now you're actually going to lose a couple more clicks. The idea that the nausea is no longer just an end the run, sometimes it's end the run and lose a click, makes it also a lot better, so it's just a bit more taxing. Now, that's kind of one of the issues with Warden, is that it encourages a certain sort of playstyle that actually gets around entirely the Warden tax, and that's running last click. If you run last click, this is a subroutine that you don't have to deal with. It's a blank subroutine, and that puts... While that seems bad, because there's a way to play that makes Warden Fatuma largely blank, you can largely capitalize on that. And I think if you're playing Warden in a deck, you want to have a deck that makes it really bad when the runner is running on their last click, and there's a lot of ways to do that. We have a Kawa Project, a relatively new agenda that is impossible to steal if the runner has no clicks left. This is a pretty good pairing, and you have cards like Strongbox that make any agenda impossible to steal if they're running last click. On top of that, we have Traps, and Traps are actually pretty cool. Cards like Tempest now makes the runner trace-free take a brain damage because they have no clicks to lose, and even things like the Spicy Prisec leave the runner with a tag that they can't clear, and you can go and capitalize on that by trashing their resources, closing their accounts, even exchanging information, which is kind of sweet, and a lot of people might not expect that. There's also some fun ice that this synergizes with. TLDR doubles the subroutines. Actually, does that work? When the runner counters the next piece of the ice, gains a second copy. Yeah, it should work, right? Inazuma gets really fun. I love Inazuma and Bioroid decks. A lot of people will face check expecting to click through things, and this makes it a lot worse when they realize they can't. And Mother Goddess, mind you, also becomes like a really big enigma if there's other Bioroids rezzed. So well, that might seem good. You also have to figure out or understand how breaking ice works. And one of the things that looks immediately really good is the idea is that you can make a 3.0 Bioroid, the only one in the game. You can make it have 4 subroutines. But how subroutines work in Netrunner is that you choose which ones you want to break. You pay the cost of breaking them, and then the subroutines that you don't break fire in order. So the idea that the Fairchild 3.0 might have 4 subroutines, but when you face check into it, you can always click through the last 3 subroutines, the pay 3 trash, brain damage, and the run one, and then Warden, the subroutine, will fire, and this does nothing if you click through the Fairchild 3.0. So a lot of the times, this actually doesn't work well with cards like Fairchild 3.0 and Kamali. It encourages the runner to click through them, which again is something we can capitalize on, as we just talked. But the subroutine itself will do nothing if they click through them, so it's kind of weird. What kind of deck do you want to play this in? Architects of Tomorrow is great. Seder is another option, but Architects of Tomorrow is probably one of the better ones. You're going to be running a lot of Bioroids. You'll get the most value of Warden. Every ice gets lose a click. The runner will probably only be running once a turn, if ever, so you're not going to be losing out fires on Architects of Tomorrow, which is pretty good, so your ice reses slowly, you get the most value. That seems pretty sweet. Do watch out, though. Freedom Kamalo trashes this for 1. And we're going to have to keep saying that about every card that's printed from now on, because while this ratio is ridiculous, it's only ridiculous against everyone besides Freedom, and Freedom seems pretty popular right now. Also, interestingly enough, and this is the thing that kind of confuses me, this card, Brain Taping Warehouse, is like so damn good in Architects of Tomorrow, but I honestly haven't seen it that much in a lot of these builds. And it's also kind of weird that these cards don't pair well together at all. Because how you counterplay Brain Taping is running last click, how you counter Warden Fatuma is running last click. So they're actually probably kind of bad in the same deck. Perhaps you can make the runner want to run first click more. There's still a lot of good ways to do that. If the runner has no clicks left, some bad things can happen to them. But that's Warden Fatuma. Runners will run last click, or they'll trash the Warden. You want to ice her up, mind you. And that's actually pretty good with architects because they have to run it, and then you get some other ice res for free. We got some Jinteki cards. This is a research security agenda. It's Jinteki 4-2. It says when the turn ends on which you scored viral weaponization, when the turn on which you scored viral weaponization ends, do a net damage for each card in the grip. Quicker and deadlier than ever imagined. The trial was an outstanding success. Oh man. So this is it's a card that does a lot of net damage, and that's always really exciting to see in Jinteki. A lot of Jinteki decks just want to do as much brain damage as they possibly could. For instance, Potential Unleashed is a deck that a lot of people, the way they play this deck is just to do as much damage to the runner, because the value of damage largely doubles until the runner has no cards left. And it's really important to understand how this damage works. It says do a net damage for each card on their grip. That fires like Cortex Lock. All the damage fires at one instant, so if I'm holding 5 cards, I lose 5 cards, and then PU, the Potential Unleashed, mills 1 card from my deck. So it's not going to do like 1 card, 1 off the top, 1 card, 1 off the top. It's just going to do 5 and 1. So in the best case scenario, if the runner has no boosted hand size, this is going to do 6 damage overall. 5 from your hand, 1 from the deck. It can easily do less if the runner has less cards in your hand. And that might seem great still for Potential Unleashed, and it may be, but it also makes it very comparable to House of Knives. House of Knives in Jinteki Potential Unleashed also does 6 damage, and this is a 3-1 agenda, which is much easier to go ahead and fast advance this out with things like Shipment from Tenon. So the question is, do you run this over House of Knives? I don't think so, specifically in that deck archetype. Maybe you have to run all 6, but that's what I found so far. This is a cool ability. It gets all cards out of hand, and this is kind of wild that Jinteki is one of the last identities or last factions to have this, because we've actually seen this ability in almost every other faction. This is Re-Education, a ridiculous NBN agenda, because they have some really weird ones, and this kind of does a very similar thing, and we even have a 3-1 HB identity, or agenda, excuse me. This card is now restricted, mind you, because the way that this card was played, you score it in a fast advanced turn, and then you do 2 damage to the runner in the same turn, and a lot of times they die, and there's very little counterplay to it. This card is now restricted. This card almost won Worlds last year because that combo is very strong, and it's cool to see that in Jinteki one, which I would have assumed would have been one of the first factions to come out with a damage agenda, is very hard to kill the runner. It is really hard to kill the runner with this, on the basis that this fires when your turn ends, so there's very few paid abilities that you can kill a runner with. I think the only one that exists in the game right now is that if the runner is tagged, if door-to-door is played, if you scored a viral weaponization, and you beat the trace, you can in theory flatline the runner once their turn starts. And I think that's the easiest one to do, and that doesn't actually seem that easy at all. Other ways to set up to kill with this agenda, perhaps you're playing a deck like, this one's actually kind of weird too. If you're playing Personal Evolution, the core set Jinteki identity, you score this, it does 1 damage to hand, which largely doesn't matter, and then it wipes the rest of the hand. I guess that's cool if the first damage when you score it hits like an I've had worse, and then they draw 3, and then you wipe out the whole hand. That's the dream. But once that fires, now the runner doesn't have any cards in hand, and they largely have to spend their next turn drawing up. And that buys you a window, because if they don't draw up, they can easily die next turn, and maybe you want to play cards like Genetics Pavilion, which you res this after they've drawn their 2nd card, and now they have to go trash this if they want to draw their 3rd card, and you can capitalize on them having less than 2 cards in hand if you have something like Ronin, which does 3 net damage out of nowhere, and that can be scary. Maybe once they have 2 cards in hand they can't run, they have to start checking your remote servers. Now, that actually in a lot of ways is comparable to Show of Force. And these are 2 4-2 agendas that are, or at least Show of Force up to date, because this is a newer card, was actually pretty common in Personal Evolution decks, on the basis that if you get a Show of Force on the table, maybe you motion it out, and the runner doesn't run it, you have a pocket 3 damage. And during 8 penny, any paid ability window, you can score the Show of Force and do 3 damage. And I think actually in terms of setting up the runner, having a Show of Force on the table is probably a better option to kill a runner than viral weaponization. Now, they technically do combo together. If you score a viral weaponization and there's a Show of Force on the table next turn, maybe you can kill them with the 3 damage, but it seems kind of difficult. And I think in a Personal Evolution deck, I'd probably actually want to Show of Force more than viral weaponization. It just seems easier to capitalize on, because a single Show of Force and a single Ronin a lot of times will kill a runner, and you don't need to do some like 2-turn combo, hope they don't draw enough, hope they don't run, and stuff like that. It's kind of unfortunate. Now you could play this as a tempo card, which is kind of interesting. Idea is you're playing maybe a Paulina Foods deck. You have good ice, cards like Data Loop, make it hard to run a remote server. Maybe you're running like Obokata Protocol, and now they have to spend the turn drawing, and if they spend the turn drawing, not only do you get 1 credit, but you also, it protects your agendas that you're putting in a remote the next turn. It's a bit of a hard argument, and I think a 4-2 agenda like Nisei Mark II might be strictly better. This kind of ensures the runner has to go through this Data Loop twice, which is largely just as good, and that's kind of strange. You can get more value with this card, I guess, with things like Paulina Agroplex, force them to draw. Maybe they have a big hand size, the mental health clinic, maybe the personalized portal kicks in, and then you wipe out their whole hand. And that's kind of cool. But that's also a comparable effect to the runner running a psychic field, which in a trap deck, something like Personal Evolution, you can just put on the table. Which is kind of weird. It's a really strange card because while it does a lot of tempo damage, it's really difficult to capitalize on with the kill. And I think things like Show of Force probably do that a bit better. But in terms of the tempo damage, there's a lot of other ways to do that. Even the runner just hitting a Show of Force, or excuse me, a Psychic Field in a trap deck does a similar thing. So I'm not actually sure if you want this. I could see this again in a potential Unleash deck where doing as much damage as possible matters. But again, I think House of Knives does the same amount of damage, and you can spread it out. They have to run, but you can spread it out, which is kind of cool. Also, again, if Fire Weaponization ever hits a I've had worse in hand, which is a good counterplay, just keep one of these to hand. Your turns are going to be really rough. Or at least your kill combo, right? This is the cool thing, though. If you ever manage to get a plan B with 4 counters, and the runner ever runs it, and you score a Viral Weaponization from hand, when the runner's turn ends, they lose their whole hand, which makes it the easiest kill setup in the world. And it'll be super, super, super sweet. The coolest thing, if this ever happens in Netrunner, if this happens at your tables, please let me know because we'll celebrate it together. Again, watch out for this one, but damn, that's cool. This is Envelope. It's a Jinteki Ice. It's a barrier and AP. Anti-personnel, wants to hurt you. Costs 4 to res, 3 strength. Not terrible. Has 2 subroutines. Do 1 net damage. End the run. On one hand, I knew I shouldn't touch it. On the other hand, it was really shiny. Cabinessa loves running for the fun. You might have seen this card before. This is a card that was in the core set, in the revised core set. It's Wall of Thorns, and Wall of Thorns doesn't see a lot of play. It largely hasn't for a long time. A big reason is that a lot of barriers aren't that great anymore, especially taxing barriers, because cards like Paperclip are probably the most, common fractor in a lot of metas. Breaks us for 4 credits. Wall of Thorns, or excuse me, Envelope is Wall of Thorns cut in half. Basically every number on there was just straight up cut in half. I guess you got a bit more strength to watch out for it. So does that make this a good ice? And mid-range barriers, mid to low range barriers in terms of cost are something that actually Jinteki doesn't have a lot of. The only ice right now they have that ticks of that card slot is Himitsubaku, a card that might not be that popular right now. Maybe it gets more popular with Ice Destruction. It might actually. But they also have this one, and this is Kakugo. And unfortunately, as much as I love to talk about like the cool combos you can do with cards, even cards that might not be the best thing, this is kind of where the train ends for me. Kakugo, if you've watched this channel for a while now, is an incredibly strong ice, and I probably complain about it a bit too much. It's nuts. It's the same res cost, it does still end the run, and while the net damage only happens when you pass it, that's going to fire more often. Having the 1 net damage subroutine on Envelope means that sometimes runner's going to hit it, sometimes it's going to do 1 net damage when they choose not to breaker, they don't have a breaker, but from then on, it's just going to increase the tax that it costs to break the Envelope, while Kakugo doesn't do anything when you face check into it, but every single time you get through it, you're going to take damage, and that's just almost infinitely better, specifically in a Jinteki deck that wants to do as much damage as possible a lot of times to protect their agendas, to make sure you have no deck or hand left to threaten kills. It's just so damn good. And Envelope costs the same, and when we're talking about Paperclip, it only costs 1 more credit to break, and that's even if they choose. Oh no, actually with Paperclip they have to break 2. So this they break for 2, this they break for 1, and Kakugo will always do net damage, which is crazy good. Question is, if you have 3 Kakugos in your deck, do you want another 4 cost barrier? Probably not. For 4 credits, you're not far off putting a more taxing card in your ice, or ice in your deck, excuse me. That's kind of unfortunate. That being said, if you are dealing with a different meta, a meta that doesn't have Paperclip, I think actually there's reasons why Envelope might be better than Kakugo, or at least might be worth considering to put in your deck at all. While Yusuf just came out, this is an annoying card for Yusuf. Any barrier that now has multiple subroutines is looking pretty good against Yusuf if that becomes popular, because now you need multiple virus counters. That's a really big deal, because if you could break this for one while running R&D and getting a Yusuf counter back, like you can for Kakugo, you're running for free, you still take net damage. Cards like Lamb actually break this for 5 credits, which is pretty sweet if you're seeing a lot of Lamb in your meta. Now, it breaks this for 2 and you take a net damage. I don't know. It's... Kakugo every time, right? Synth DNA modification, maybe you want more AP Ice in your deck, so you want an envelope over Himitsu Bako. This is the first time a subroutine on AP Ice is broken, so there's like... the scaling is not infinite. There's like a... what's it called? It doesn't scale as well. Maybe you have enough AP Ice. I think 100% the best thing I can say about this ice specifically is that one of the weaknesses of Kakugo is if you have this on a central server, which is a really great place to put this, especially on R&D or HQ. You can't take the net damage to check HQ or R&D. It makes the turning wheel check a bit more taxing, because a lot of times people will play turning wheel, run into Kakugo 3 or 4 times, and then just get free counters. You can't do that with envelope. A lot of times you pay 2 credits. That's the best I have to say. Really unfortunate. Just love the art on this piece of ice. But, yeah, it's unfortunate. Kakugo's really good. This is Mwanza City Grid. Oh, actually, no, this is a cool thing to see. Oh, I didn't save this. I'm actually surprised that we didn't see this a bit sooner. This is original Netrunner, right? So, card title, no. Card text. Original Netrunner, this sort of formatting where we had like an ice that does net damage and the run was actually pretty common. There was a fair bit of them. And while there was no factions, you can actually see this is almost a direct reprint of Laser Wire. And this was like in the original set, which is kind of cool to see. But you see that this was like a really common thing back in Netrunner in the days. I think, yeah, Shotgun Wire here is a direct reprint. Let's zoom in. Of, what's it called? That other one we thought, Wall of Thorns. And there's a lot of them. Like this is Chiashi. And it's kind of cool that this happened more often. I think face checking was probably a bit more of a punishment. But to me, this sort of design doesn't carry over that well in this game. Specifically when there's other options that are a lot better. Old Netrunner cards are actually pretty cool. This is Mwanza City Grid. It's our last Jinteki card. It costs 0 to res. It's a region upgrade, and it says install only in the root of HQ or R&D. Already interesting. Whenever the runner accesses cards from this server, they access 3 additional cards. After accessing, gain 2 credits for each card accessed. And this applies even during the turn where the runner trashes Mwanza City Grid. It's limited 1 region per server. It costs 5 to trash, and it's only 1 influence, which is absolutely nutty. Mwanza is actually a real place. This is Lake Victoria. This is the south tip of Lake Victoria. That's zoomed in relatively elegantly. And we saw on a map of Nalubaale, which, by the way, is the name for Lake Victoria in Lugandan, is right here on the south coast. And this place exists modernly. And I love that we see a lot of like destinations that really exist and then exploration of what's happening there in X years whenever Netrunner takes place. And Mwanza is a real place. It has about 800,000 people in it right now. It is in Tanzania. It is the 2nd largest city there. Here's some images. Let's zoom in a bit. It's cool. You can see some influences with the architecture and the architecture here. There's sort of like African architecture influences, but like that sort of stuff. It's pretty cool. I like it a lot. I also like this card a lot. I think this card is nuts because basically how it works, you put this on HQ or R&D, the runner runs it, and they're going to access 1 card from R&D, let's say, and they're going to access 3 more cards from R&D because of Mwanza, and then they're going to access Mwanza itself, which means you've just got 10 credits. You res this for 0. You just got 10 credits. Now, if the runner trashes this, they just paid 5 credits, which means that this card is a 15 credit swing, which is a count siphon, right? It's all the count siphon. Am I right? It's really great. And it can be very obvious that making the runner access more than 1 card whenever they run R&D or HQ is a huge issue, and largely that is the case. If you have agendas in your deck, the runner is more likely to find them and find them quickly and a lot of them at once, which will lose you the game in 90% of decks. But where this card succeeds is at a 1 influence splash in 10% of decks where this ability is absolutely bonkers, and I think it is nutty, and let's dive into it real bit. Alright. Let's play Jinteki. We don't want to spend 1 influence. Let's play Jinteki. We're playing Personal Evolution. Every time that you hit an agenda, you're going to take some damage. And that's great because when you run this, you're going to hit a bunch of agendas. And it's not only agendas. It's so easy to make a Personal Evolution deck and jam 3 snares in it, 3 Breach Domes, 3 Chrysalis, why not? 3 Project Kusanagis, which when you steal them, nothing really bad happens for the runner, or for the corp. Maybe turntable, I don't know. But you take damage and it's gonna be a lot of damage. It's not that difficult to see that the runner runs R&D, or HQ, mind you, and hits 2 snares and you win. They can hit a snare and a chrysalis, and then a breach dome and an agenda, and you win. Mind you, these could all easily be 3-ofs in the deck, and even cards like this, which seem kind of rough because the runner has a big chance of hitting 2 of these in a run and the game could be over really soon. This lets you, if they hit this, set up the next 6 cards, hopefully, that they access, and then they can die. And this also lets you draw your punitive counterstrike, and maybe they hit this 3-pointer and another snare, and now they have less credits when they clear the tag, and I guess you paid 4 for this, but you punitive them, because you just gained 10 credits. It's nutty. It is literally nutty. It forces them to hit the traps, and gives you a bunch of money for doing it. I love it. And it's not just Jinteki. This is Harpsichord Studios, an agenda or an identity, that does not care if the runner sees 5 cards off of R&D or HQ, because they can't steal a lot of them agendas. They can go ahead and hit the TGTBT and steal it and take a tag. Sometimes they hit this and they can't steal it. They take a tag. And then they hit the Explodapalooza and you gain 5 credits. And they hit the product placement and you get 2 more credits. They hit the news team. They now have a tag or -1 agenda points, 2 tags. And then sometime after that, they hit the Quantum Kitty while they have a tag and you score it. You also have cards like Archangel, which are also fantastic. And again, paying 3 for this, and then even boosting this trace doesn't matter much because you're gaining 10 credits. You're getting an absurd amount of money. And that can be all the money you need for the C-Source that you're going to fire next turn once they score your global food from R&D that you're going to exchange of information back from that Quantum Kitty they gave you. Absolutely nuts. In Argus, which is probably the only other identity I think they can pull this off really compelling, and it's probably the worst of them, but still pretty great. Give them the agendas. They take the tag, they take the meat damage, you got traps, import snare, it gives you a lot of agendas, they steal them, you get stock buyback. It's great. 1 influence gives you 10 credits. There's a big reason why you'd actually want to play localized product lines in these decks. You can maybe pay for it with the 4 credits, put 3 snares in your HQ. If they run it, there's a big chance they lose the game. Mind you, you are going to need 12 credits, but there's a chance they just can't run HQ anymore, and that's absolutely nuts. And while this is a region, it's not unique. Put 1 on R&D, 1 on HQ. Very important to understand too, you get the money after all the accesses are done. So it's not like they access snare, you gain 2 credits, you can fire snare with 4 credits. They access all 5 cards. Once they're done, once it runs over, then you gain the 10 credits. So just make sure you have the money up front. This also brings up a really interesting rules thing, and that is the fact that at some point, this will probably lose you the game. Because if the runner is on 5 or 6 agenda points, and now the runner can run R&D, and while there's a chance to hit a bunch of traps, there's also a big chance that they just win the game, which means you probably want to delete this card. You probably want to overinstall on it. And there's a really weird ruling here that deals with the fact that upgrades on central servers are not considered to be in the remote. They're considered to be in the root of the central server. They're not, in the server, they're in the root of the central server, which means some of the rules fall apart. While you install a card in a remote server, you can always trash cards over it. So if this was in a remote server, which mind you it couldn't be, you can install like another agenda or an asset or an upgrade and decide to trash the Mwanza. If you read the ruling right here, when an asset or upgrade is installed, the corporation can pay its res cost. Well, hold on. When installing a card in a server, the corporation can first trash any cards already installed in the server. Problem with upgrades on central servers, they're not in a server. They're in the root. It's a very technical thing, but it makes it that you can't actually trash your Mwanza City Grid once it's on the central server. I thought originally when I played these decks that I'd play other upgrades that I could install over the Mwanza to get rid of it when it made no sense to have it anymore, but you can't do that. This is something that's they're aware of. This is Jacko Draco, Jacob Morris, who does the UFAX, stuff like that. And Jacko specifically sees this as an oversight that's been brought to our attention. They're going to make a small clarification on the install section of the rulebook. So this might change at some point in the future, or they might clarify it that that's actually how it's meant to work. Either way, it makes this card more interesting. I think actually the only way to trash it is like scoring a standoff and then the runner letting you trash stuff. That might be the only way. It's a really cool card. You also res it for 0. And spoilers, which is no longer spoilers considering the pack is probably out by now. The new account siphon is out. And that means that there's actually a big amount of value of having a card that costs 0 that can make you bounce back really quickly. And while this still only fits in a niche amount of decks, those amount of decks also have a problem with economy. A lot of times if you're firing all the snares, if you're firing all these 3-1 agendas, the small agendas that you spend a lot of time and money advancing, you're going to have little money. And this makes your traps scarier and gives you money. Sometimes this will look like a Hokusai grid, and the runner will run R&D when you have no credits, and you can go ahead and res it, and that's pretty great. Fantastic card. I think if this is on a remote server, or sorry, on a central server, you can largely never run those central servers against trap decks. So that puts the whole game in remotes, for better or for worse. Besides this lovely card. This is a Kitsune, the Fox. And if Kitsune fires, you res Kitsune and Mwanza City Grid at the same time on HQ, you can make the runner access 4 cards from HQ while they're running a remote on a trap ice. And that's, again, very disgusting. This is a reason why you might want to go get 3 snares from your deck with a localized product line, and then they hit the Kitsune and they could just die. It's gross. You also get the money. It's really gross. Gotta watch out for this card. This makes trap decks really potent. Big fan. We hit our NBN cards. I think we have 2, and this is standard procedure. It's a zero-cost operation. Oh, yeah, zero-cost operation, right? Man, mandatorily, we have to do this now for every time we see a card like this. It costs 0. Freedom trashes it for free. Standard procedure also gets trashed for free. It's play only if the runner made a successful run during their last turn. Name a card type. Reveal the grip of the runners. Gain 2 credits for each card in the grip that has the name type. It's an economy card. It's an information card. And it punishes the runner for holding cards in hand. And that last part about punishing the runner for holding cards in hand is something that I love that NBN has now. Sweepspeak is one of my favorite cards thematically. You're playing a media corporation, you're playing somebody who cares about getting psychographics and info about your consumers, and punishing the runner for consuming, having a lot of things in their access. I love the flavor so much. And while the flavor with the term standard procedure is, I think, less strong than Sweepspeak, that brings that idea back. If the runner has 5 cards in hand, you're going to get more money. The way to counterplay against NBN is consume less. And I love that. That's great. There's a good combination here between theme and mechanics. Sweepspeak did it the best, I think. This is really good. Again, it also punishes big hand size decks, which is cool to see. Cards like Opolis, cards like, I don't know, the game day archetypes with origami. There's also some cool niche plays for this. But on its own, it's an economy card. You can play at 0 credits. And we've seen other ones like this. I've actually seen people play this card in like spending influence on it as an economy card. In the late game, you play biased reporting. Sometimes you pay 2 credits for it, and you can gain 6 to 8 credits. Maybe you say resource, maybe you say program. This card also gives the runner a choice. While standard procedure costs 0, it's good. I like it a lot. I like it a lot. It has a chance of giving you more money, and it also has a chance of just giving you information. Not a chance, it'll always give you information. This combos well with kind of knowing the meta. If you have an understanding about the decks that your opponents are playing, if you have an understanding of what's popular in the meta, whether that be your kitchen table or whether that be the tournament tables at wherever, this card also is kind of a high skill cap card. You can understand that they're holding their events in hand, and you want to play into that. It also combos well with a bunch of the cards that we've been seeing this cycle that return cards to sender. Cards like Threat Assessment, which puts a card back on top of the stack, and then you can call it with a standard procedure and guarantee credits. Cards like Harsh Sashandra, which I've honestly not seen a lot of play, get value from this too, which is cool because this card probably needs a bit more support. But that being said, at 0 credits, this is a pretty low risk cost. And a lot of times you can just say event, you can just say largely it's going to be event or resource, and you will make 2 to 4 credits, which is not that bad at 0 credits. And this is something we said again with cards like Account Siphon being new and back in the game, not specifically Account Siphon, but Account Siphon 2.0, having a card that can be a strong economy card that you can play for 0 credits in your deck has a bunch of value. I think if the new Account Siphon is popular, which I'm pretty sure it will be, cards like this get even better. This card also pairs with a cool package we've seen before, which is Salim's Hospitality. Once you've seen their hand with procedure, whether or not you gained money, it's easy to snipe cards out of hand because you've seen them. It's the same idea with Ibrahim Salem. And you also notice this is a card that wants you to spend influence on other Jinteki or NBN cards, and this is a pretty low influence card, and I've been trying this a lot out in Scorpius defense systems. You can play standard procedure, you can name programs. A lot of times runners will keep their programs in hand because they don't want to install them until they need them, and then you can go hit them with Salims and remove them from the game. It's also pretty sweet with Hatch a Job because you can bounce the program to hand, make money off of it. No, largely you're just going to go ahead and Salims them. But that is the package of destruction in NBN, and it is pretty viable. You could even play this in NBN, people might not expect it. You're just gonna have to make sure that you can deal with things like these, because these are very popular and trashing them just doesn't do enough. I also think this card is really playable in this Maria tech. Smart Tech is a very popular ID right now. It might be one of the most popular IDs. It's kind of like engineering the future, but an NBN, and people like that a lot. And this card has an ability of shaping what's in the runner's hand. It's very easy to call resource or event over and over again. It's very easy to play scarcity resources, and that kind of carves, it shapes what's in the hand of a runner. And so you can make it, like the best counterplay to Ismari is if they keep calling event every turn, is to save a turn where you play 3 events in the same turn. And that's very easy to not only play standard procedure to get most value, but play standard procedure, see what's in their hand, and then also intelligently call Ismari EdTech's ability and say, oh, you have a lot of hardware. I'm going to call hardware, which I don't think I've ever seen anyone call hardware, so that would be fun. It's cool. It's a zero cost decon card. I got to say that again. With an account siphon existing very soon, it has a lot of value on its own. It's not that difficult to play this for 4 credits. It's not that difficult to play this for 6 credits if you're having a bit of tech in your deck, things like Ismari or Scarcity. I'm a big fan. It's a pretty easy econ card. They have to run, mind you, so this does encourage decks that do run some assets. This is what I think of when I say asset. Maybe not the best example, but there are some counterplay to that, but that's pretty sweet. And this is our last Jinteki card. It's Intake. It's an upgrade ambush. Hey, Mwanza, how's it going? Cost 0 to res. Man, all these cards get just absolutely destroyed by Freedom. And if it's accessed from R&D, the runner has to reveal it. It's an ambush. When the runner accesses Intake, go ahead and do Trace 4. If successful, add an installed program or virtual resource to the grip. Return to sender. Again, more value with standard. Ignore this ability if the runner accesses Intake from archives. It's 3 influence, 0 to trash. You hit this, you almost always trash it. Trace 4, return a thing. So it's in the runner's best interest if their thing installed costs more or is similar to the trace, they always pay the trace. And you can make that a bit harder with things like NBNs making news. That's a trace 6 off the bat. That can be pretty good. It also, maybe you want to get some value here with controlling the message, where now if they want to trash this on R&D, if it's installed, they can also take another trace, which can be rough. Bouncing things to hand, it's only going to be programs or virtual resources, which means that this card has a certain time period in the game where it's valuable. Virtual resources they're actually pretty common nowadays. There's a lot of good ones, and there's a lot of good ones where bouncing them actually gives you more value. I think the 2 specific ones we'll call out here is Netrunner, which can have a bunch of credits on it, while you can always use those credits to beat the trace, which kind of makes it rough. Bouncing this while it has a bunch of credits on it, at least abstractly, is very good. That'll probably never happen. Cards like Liberated Account, if they're installed. Wait, why did I pull this up? This is a terrible, it's not virtual, but I guess the other good one is Turning Wheel. Turning Wheel is a nice virtual resource, and if you bounce this while all the tokens on it, it's dope. In terms of programs, you can get value. A lot of programs cost around 4 to 5 credits, so you want to pay 4 into it. I think the best value you'll get here is bouncing an Amakuwa with a bunch of counters on it, because it's as if you purged, let alone they have to reinstall the thing, and that's pretty sweet. Yeah, I pulled up all these cards, not realizing this does something else. It's fine. Yeah. Now, issue being is we've seen another card that does this. This is Archangel, which is a really good card. It costs 4 to res, it's an ice. If the runner hits this from R&D or HQ, you go ahead and do a trace 6, which while you did pay 3 credits into it, you do get a pretty reasonable trace. You pay 3 credits to get 2 extra. You can choose not to fire it, and this card can't be trashed. And when you draw it, it's a fine piece of ice. And I'm surprised that these cards are very similar. Archangel, mind you, lets you bounce anything, and that's really valuable. Runners also don't expect it, but I guess this ambush on R&D is the same thing. But the question here is, if I'm going to have 2 cards in my deck that do this ability, would I rather enter Archangel or Intake? And I'm going to always say Archangel. Now, you might not have all the card pool, so Intake does a really cool thing if you don't own Data and Destiny. Mind you, Data and Destiny is a great box to pick up. It has the mini factions, let alone some good yellow cards. But I'm surprised that these things do such a similar thing. Again, Archangel bounces any card, which is a lot more valuable. Sometimes this will do nothing. Yeah, that's Intake. It's a trace, it's a trap. You can play with Mwanza and trace 4 in the early game to bounce maybe, I don't know, a virtual resource you put down in the early game. Otherwise, you're generally going to boost into the trace, and it's going to be a trade of credits. The runner pays 6 to keep their Amakuwa. Is that good? I don't know. We've also seen similar upgrades to this, and I like this card way more than I think I do, which is Will-O-Wisp, which costs 4, which maybe you have to boost 4 into this trace, and lets you put an icebreaker on the bottom of the deck, which is largely better than putting it into the grip. That being said, this is a trashable, it's not an ambush, so figure out what your deck wants better. Last 2 cards. This is Masvingo. It's a Whale and Dice, it's a barrier, it's 3 to res, 3 strength, and it says Masvingo can be advanced. When you res Masvingo, go ahead and place an advancement token on it, and it's going to gain end the run for each advancement token on it. No matter which direction Z climbed, the blocks reshuffled, zipping in from left to right, bottom to top. It was going to be a long hike to influence. This one actually has some cool backstory to it. Fort Victoria. Excuse me? Yes. Masvingo is a place in... Wow. Where is it? In Zimbabwe. Excuse me. It's a city in Zimbabwe. It used to be known as Fort Victoria. It was renamed only in 1982. This is one of the early settlements that the British colonialists had in Zimbabwe, and it's now been called Masvingo. And at Masvingo, there's specifically a fort called Fort Masvingo. Am I making this up? Am I getting confused about this fort and that other fort? No, there's a fort here. Maybe it's Fort Victoria, excuse me. It's Fort Victoria. Point being is that Masvingo is largely related to a fort city. And this is why we're having a barrier that built itself really strong. And it looks like you have brick settlement here, which is kind of cool. Another really cool thing about this card is that you might see this and think ZO. It looks like a typo. It's actually not. Those are gender neutral pronouns, or maybe even gender neutral is not the right term, but it's really cool. It's a very Netrunner thing where we see a lot of inclusion and representation of a lot of people. Big fan of that. This card, though, is wall static. Isn't that cool? I think, is it cool? This is the first time we've seen this, where they printed a factioned card, which is a neutral card, straight up, but strictly better. And whether or not that's exciting, it's up to you to find out. But wall static is a 3-cost, 3-strength end run barrier, and if you don't advance Masvingo, you res it. It's basically wall static plus. Kind of weird. I'd assumed it would have had an extra strength or something to differentiate with it. I guess the rest of the text is pretty good, but that's a starting point. Now, Wayland has a lot of advanceable barriers that when you hit them, they just end the run, and you can spend time and credits and advancements on them to make it better. And I'd argue that majority of the time, 90% of the time, having an ability like Masvingo that doesn't get taller, like the ice wall when you advance it, but actually gets wider, is preferable. And that's because we've been seeing a lot of cards like Bahali and Kongamata that recently came out that deal with ice wall, even like a 300 strength ice wall relatively well, while Masvingo is still harder to deal with. It's better against cards like David, it's better against cards like Femme Fatale, and all these cards are pretty present as ways to deal with big ice. So if you spend all your time and money and effort to make your ice wall a big ice, you're going to look pretty silly when either of these three things show up on the table, and they're all pretty common cards in all different archetypes. Now, Masvingo does have a bunch of counters on its own, cards like Grappling Hook pair well with the Kamali. We've seen things like Lamb just come out the cycle that break it relatively well, but these are less common than either of these three. So if you want to ask me whether I want to advance my Ice Wall or my Masvingo, I'll take this every time. Yeah, that's kind of cool. This also reminds of an old ice that used to exist. This is Tyrant, and you can kind of see how far the design of this game came. I don't, again, think this is at all power creep to be concerned about because Tyrant was so far below the curve that it's fine if a card is better than it. Tyrant cost more than half. It had one more strength. Same ability largely, but when you res it honestly did nothing. And while this card is obviously bad, objectively not great, specifically compared to Masvingo, it actually did see some play. I've seen people play Tyrant in their Tenon decks that would get a bunch of free advancement counters, and Masvingo is an easy inclusion into there as well. You get a bunch of advancement counters at this point. At some point, this becomes a Hive with no drawbacks that you res for 2 cheaper, and that's relatively cool. Hive is a really strong piece of ice. Also, again, if we talked about the most common barrier breaker, adding subroutines is dope against Paperclip. It's kind of what you want to be doing. I guess adding strength is just as good, but whatever. You can also play this in SSO, the new HB identity that just came out. If you get SSO, you get a 3-point agenda down. You're resing your Masvingo, it has 4 subroutines. Again, that's very much like a Hive. You paid 3 credits for. That's always good. Builder Nations, it's an ice that gets a free advancement token, which I don't think we've ever seen before, and it makes Builder Nations have immediate value. And that was one of the problems with Builder Nations. It's expecting you to do this thing that makes every ice Kakugo, and Jinteki just has Kakugo, so what are we fighting? Even in Titan Transnational, it might be fine. Getting a free advancement counter puts you halfway there if you want to play a Trickle Light deck, which might be a reasonable deck. It's a cheap way to fast advance, and again, with new account siphon, maybe that's all you want. Also, a Doodadwa came out. And these two combo really well together. The Doodadwa makes the Masvingo bigger and bigger and bigger. Figure out where you want to put either of these on the remote, maybe one on the remote, one on the central server. So they always fire well. And there's a bunch of other cards. Anytime you see an Advancable Ice in Wayland, the same cards come up. Priority Construction makes us a 4/3, dope. Dedication Ceremony makes us a 4/3 if it's res, dope. And Mass Commercialization gets your money back, which is really good. You also have Red Planet Couriers to eventually fast events, dope agendas out, or maybe even move all your counters to Masvingo and you have a 20 subroutine ice, which tickles you. And Hollywood Renovation also is a pretty good tempo card. It makes your Masvingo real big. Install Advance. This has tokens. It's good. It's really good in terms of a very efficient Wayland end to run ice, and it keeps happening. Wayland ice largely has been super interesting with cards like Hortum and Mouseless. These are really cool, interesting ice. And we've seen this time and time again where whenever Wayland needs ice, they end up just printing something that has end the run on it. And I'm finding it harder and harder as time goes on to be excited about that. Back in the day, there was this cycle, I think it was Breaker Bay specifically, and this cycle that came out with this like Founders Ice that was like super interesting and nuanced, and like HB got this Wild Turing, which was a huge meta card for a while. Crick came out, it was a Wild Crick, and it had some cool effects, and then Wayland obviously gets a Bastion that's sometimes cheaper than Bastion, and sometimes... and this kind of feels like that. It's like, oh, it's a Hive sometimes if it has more value into it, and I don't know, man. I love to see Wayland go into different places. I understand the brash and the run. We build in walls. It's all good Wayland flavor, but it's losing its edge on me because we've been seeing this for too long. And while other decks are getting interesting stuff, we're just getting, at the end of the day, a big wall. Yikes. Firewall? Yeah. Would you rather play these? Yeah, I think I'd rather play Masvingo than Firewall. This is Overseer Matrix. It's our last card. It's another Wayland upgrade. It says when the runner trashes a card in this server, you may pay a credit to give the runner a tag. This also applies during the run on which the runner trashes Overseer Matrix, so it protects itself and other stuff. It's only 1 to res, so you're generally going to be paying at least 2 credits to get some value here, and it's 2 to trash. The blast doesn't hurt you. What comes after does. 4 influence. Pretty hard to splash this thing. This thing is wild. On its own, it does nothing, but it is a defensive upgrade for largely assets, but more defensive upgrades. And there's some pretty cool combos here in HB. Or Wayland, excuse me. I think straight up the best thing here is you get Prisec, and you can now make your Prisecs multiplicatively better. If you have a Prisec in the server, the runner runs it, you pay 2 credits, they got a tag and immediate damage. Now if they want to trash it, you pay an extra credit, now they have to take another tag. They can go ahead and trash the Overseer Matrix and come back, and now they have to make 2 runs, and you did spend about 5 credits, they now have a bunch more tags, and they took a bunch more meat damage, and things get out of control kind of fast. Also, like KP Lin is basically like a different Prisec. I don't like it as much. And you can build servers that get really annoying to trash the things in it, and it's not only assets or upgrades, you can also do this with assets. It's also very important to understand that this is not a unique card. So again, while these do kind of compound in some way that's probably not technically mathematically exponentially, but sounds like mathematically exponentially, localized product line, install 3 Overseer Matrix on the same server. And while you're going to be spending a lot of credits, if my math is not incorrect, if the runner trashes one of them, they gain like what? If they want to trash all of them, it's like 9 tags. Seems good. We can spam these. And Gagarin's kind of interesting. Because if you have multiple cards in a remote server with Gagarin, you can actually refuse to pay credits to ever access the card. So if they res an Overseer Matrix, you can pay a credit, trash the Overseer Matrix, and then come back later. So the price tag is never going to hit you. So that's generally better if you're running other defensive remotes. Or, sorry, if you're running other upgrades. Wow. If you're running other assets. It's a pretty good pair with Dedication Response Team because this ensures you end your run with a tag. It also is kind of cool with other stuff like Mr. Stone, which wants you to take tags to do meat damage, so you can make things look really difficult to trash, and Zealous Judge is up there too, with cards that if they trash the thing, you res the judge, now they have to go trash the judge, and maybe they'll end their turn with a tag. You can build these no-win scenario turns. It's also really cool with Commercial Bankers Group. This is a card that protects assets, and if you put this on Commercial Bankers Group, they're going to have to run it. They're going to have to generally either run this server twice, which is probably even more annoying if you put a price tag on it, or take a tag. I guess you can just run, trash the Matrix, come back, run, trash this. It probably comes about to the same. It's also absolutely disgusting with Mumbai Virtual Tour. They have to trash this. They take 5, pay 5, take a tag. They trash this. I don't know. It's wild. I'm glad that this is 4 influence, so it's a bunch harder to play this in controlling the message, because otherwise this would be pretty gross pretty fast. And you can do some weird, wacky stuff with cards like World's Plaza. I don't know, this actually probably doesn't work well together because you just trash this, or even Full Immersion Rec Studio, that probably doesn't work well together. Now, the problem with this card on its own is that it's actually very comparable to Prisek, but it needs more card support and it needs more card draw. So if I was to play this in the deck, I'd probably want a lot of good draw. Illegal Arms Factory, it's not bad as something to defend this remote, but also it lets you draw into more things, where if you draw your Overseer Matrix, you draw your Priseks at the same time, and you can build that cool defensive remote. On its own, it's honestly a very rubbish card unless you have other things to stack it to. There is some value of putting things into remote servers the runner runs, but you need a lot of good draw, and that's where the question is on its own I'd rather run Prisek than Overseer Matrix, but if I'm running 3 Priseks, I would definitely consider this because it can make things really taxing really fast. I also do adore the art. The sort of digital sea mine, the naval mine, is always evocative. Man, these things are absolutely terrifying to me. That's it. That's the pack. This is Whispers in Nalubaale. It's been a wild pack, and again, I don't want to diminish from this one, but the pack that comes out today or yesterday or whenever you're watching this, minus how many days, is a crazy pack. So I'm glad to get this one out of the way. There's still a lot of really good stuff in here, and the value of all these cards is going to change radically based off of the value of the cards coming up in the next pack. I can't talk enough about how the next pack is nuts, but we have some really strong things here. The runner side was really great, and we have a really good 4-2 agenda. Mwanza, I think, is so fun and builds so many decks and strengthens a lot of really fun trap decks, which is really great. I do think Standard Procedure is really cool, and Masvingo is a pretty solid ice if you've been doing the advanceable ice stuff. Those are my highlights from this pack. Let me know what you've been liking so far in this pack. Always am excited to hear what cool combinations I'm missing, what kind of cool decks you're excited to make from this stuff, or have been making, I guess, for the last couple weeks or so and going forward. We'll have the new data pack unboxing sooner than this one. If you're around on Thursdays, drop by our stream. We're going to be trying out the new stuff as it comes out, and we've been playing a lot of this stuff over the last couple weeks. Thanks so much for watching.